Hello everyone. In the last class we discussed about the nature of public policy. So after understanding this public policy aspects, some concepts as well. So first of all we'll be discussing what is the political process for policy decision. Okay, we'll be highlighting the rent seeking, although we'll be in brief discussing Arrow's impossibility theorem, followed by Theodore Lowi's policy typology, right? And different types of typology as advocated by Theodore. Okay, so let's begin our discussion by taking into account the political process for policy decisions. Okay, so just to remind, we have already discussed in previous lectures the application of equity and justice to public policy, the significance of public policy, and also under what situation government interventions are required, right? And so all these are discussed. So given this understanding, now we can discuss what are the required policy processes for policy decisions. Okay, so for policy decisions, right, we need to involve the political process. Okay, so that means if you have to take policy decisions, we have to take the preferences of everyone. So policy decision cannot reflect upon the preference of a single individual or single citizen. Rather, it should be based on the preferences of everyone, that is aggregate preferences. This particular principle is based on the fairness, right? And we have already discussed this equity and fairness, right? And so for taking the policy decisions, we have to refer to a particular system, and many countries are nowadays practicing what is known as the democratic system of governance and democratic system of policy decision making. So in democratic system, somehow we can find somehow that the aggregate preferences of the citizens are taken into account, right, for a particular course of actions. And we can also find that politics is very important, and politics is the process by which both good policy can occur and bad policy can also occur, right? So what is your responsibility as a reader, as a policy analyst or policy scientist? So a policy scientist must understand the political processes, right? What is the benefit if a policy scientist understands the policy processes? The benefits are many. That the first one could be that if a policy analyst can understand the policy processes, then can explain some policy outcome, right? So that it can also help in designing effective democratic institutions and also helpful in operating strategically and effectively within the system as well. So all these are the benefits that the policy analyst can get if he understands or if she understands the political processes. So political processes is very important for the analyst, right, in order to analyze the policy decisions. Okay, so as I told you that for policy decision making, the preferences are taken into account, and the preferences are the aggregate preferences, right, societal preferences rather than an individual's preferences. Okay, so that means public policy requires the collective decisions, right? For any kind of policy making, we need to take into account the decisions and preferences of everyone, that is collective decisions reflecting aggregate preferences. Okay, so we can take some examples that for public policy, how do we take into account the aggregate preferences rather than a single preferences. So for example, we can take the case of a federal state, right? So a federal state must decide whether to distribute river water among neighboring states. Okay, so many times we are finding many federal states in India, and they are trying to distribute river water among the neighboring states. Okay, so that is that how river water should be distributed depends on the aggregate preferences of the citizens of that federal state rather than the preference of a single individual. Okay, so from federal state we can move to a nation or country. So we can take this case that a country must decide whether to make military strike against another country. So now today's society, we can find so many military strikes and attempts that are being taken by many countries against many countries. Okay, and the third example, we can move to a global case, that is international community. Okay, so the international community must decide whether to reduce the greenhouse gases, right? So that means all these are decisions okay, whether to reduce the greenhouse gas or not, whether to make military strike against another country, or whether to distribute river water among the neighboring states. Okay, so all these are decisions, but how do a state, a country, or international community take a decision? So that is the question. So for that we have to take into account the political process, that is democratic process of policy making. Okay, so any democratic process requires aggregating preferences in order to reach a common decision, right? But if you see, however, we can see that there is no single process for this aggregating preferences. Okay, and even though we are finding the aggregating preferences, okay, that may not guarantee to produce the best policy outcomes. Okay, so that is the reason we need to take into account that what are the options available, right, or what are the methods and processes available for aggregating preferences. Okay, so for example, we can take the case of direct democracy. Okay, simultaneously we can also take into account representative democracy, so through which we take a decision, right, but the decision that we take may not produce the best policy outcome. So what is this direct democracy? In direct democracy, all the actors have the voice in decision making process to vote directly on a particular matter, right? But in representative democracy, it is not directly voted, rather the voters choose the representatives, right, and the representatives make a voice in decision making. Okay, so that is the difference between the direct democracy and the representative democracy. In both the cases we can say that aggregate preferences are taken into account for decision making. Okay, but the question is that, isn't there a best way for making democratic decisions, or is there a best way for making a democratic decision? Okay, so in order to understand this, we must know what is known as the Arrow's impossibility theorem. Okay, so what is this Arrow's impossibility theorem, right? So, and in order to understand this democratic decisions, we need to understand the impossibility theorem by Arrow. Okay, and his contributions, right, to these democratic decisions, that how decisions are reached, is really one of the seminal idea in political economy and political science, policy decision making as well, right? So in Arrow's work evaluated the social welfare function, right, not the individual welfare function. And in social welfare function is a function or is a process of converting the preferences of many individuals into the preferences for the group as a whole. Okay, so the thing is that we are taking into account the social welfare function, right, and for reaching this social welfare function we are taking into account the preferences of many individuals that can reflect the preferences for the group as a whole. Okay, so all voting systems that nowadays we are practicing for electing our representatives, so these are the form of the social welfare function only. Okay, what is the finding that we are getting from Arrow's work, right? So if you see the findings, then we can, if you analyze his work, then we can find that that when three or more options are available and they are considered, then no social welfare function is able to generate a group decision from individual preferences without violating certain basic conditions. Okay, so what are those basic conditions which are likely to be, which are definitely violated, right? So those are unrestricted domain, okay, completeness, transitivity, Pareto optimality, non-dictatorship, and independence of irrelevant alternatives. So all these conditions are there, right? But when options are available, or when alternatives, three or more alternatives are taken into account, no social welfare function is able to generate a group decision from the individual preferences without violating these the basic conditions. Okay, so that is the reason it is important to understand these conditions. So for example, the first one, that is unrestricted domain. So what is this unrestricted domain? So we can say that the decision making process should be able to take all the possible sets of rational individual preferences, okay, and generate some preferred ordering for the group that we are taking into account. So for example, we can take this. So let's say if all individuals rank their preferences, Okay, so preferences, like let's say individual's first preference is, let's say, BJP candidate, right? BJP candidate. So that is the first preference. Okay, the second preference could be Congress candidate. Okay, and the third preference of individuals could be the TVK's candidate. Okay, so if it is so, then under this unrestricted domain, okay, so then the social welfare function should be able to rank the preferences for the group as a whole, because these are the preferences for the individuals. So given these preferences, the social welfare function should be able to rank the preferences for the group as a whole. So these are the individual preferences. From the individual preferences, the group preferences can be found out. Okay, and the second basic assumption is the completeness. So what is this completeness? That any voting system or social welfare function must deliver a very clear decision. So what is this clear decision? Let's say again we are taking into account this example, right? So the BJP candidate is preferred to Congress candidate. Okay, right? So if BJP candidate is preferred to Congress candidate, right, or Congress candidate is preferred to BJP candidate, right, or voters are indifferent between these two candidates, BJP candidate and Congress candidate. So that means it is giving a clear message, clear preference, that what the citizens need, what is the preference of the individuals, and what is the preference of the average citizens. Okay, so that is the completeness. That means the through this voting system or through this social welfare function, it is it must clear, it must deliver a clear answer or a clear picture, that who is preferred above what, right? The third basic assumption is transitivity, right? So what is this transitivity? So again we can take this example of preference for BJP candidate, Congress candidate and TVK's candidate. So if BJP candidate is preferred over Congress candidate, right, and Congress candidate is preferred over TVK's candidates, then it is understood that BJP candidate, right, is preferred over TVK's candidate. Okay, right? So in public finance, we also have understood that if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C, right? So this is the condition for, this is the assumption for our transitivity. Okay, and the fourth assumptions of Arrow's impossibility theorem is, if every individual in a group prefers, let's say that prefers A option over B, then the group must also prefer A over B. That is what is known as Pareto optimality. Okay, so the next condition is about non-dictatorship. Okay, what is this non-dictatorship? That the social welfare function cannot merely reflect on the preference of a single individual, right, or one individual, while ignoring the preferences of the remaining voters or remaining individuals. Okay, and the last one is about the independence of irrelevant alternatives. That means the social ordering of two choices. Okay, social ordering of two choices. We can again go back to our example, this example, preferences of individuals, right? So we can say that, let's say that BJP candidate and Congress candidate must not be affected by a third candidate, that is TVK's candidate. Okay, so that is independence of irrelevant alternatives. So if BJP candidate is preferred over Congress candidate in a particular situation, right, and when, let's say, another candidate is in picture, that is TVK's candidate, in that case the preference should not be changed. Rather, the same preference should be there, that BJP candidate would be preferred over the Congress candidate. Okay, so that is what is known as the irrelevant alternatives, that after the introduction or addition of a particular new alternative, the original preference should not be changed. Okay, so that is the social ordering between two choices. Here we are considering BJP candidate and Congress candidate. They must not be affected by a third alternative, that is the TVK's candidate here. Okay, given these the basic assumptions, right, we can draw the conclusion from Arrow's that when there are 3 or more options available, no social function is able to generate a group decision from individual preferences without violating these conditions, these basic conditions. So, that is the findings of Arrow. So, detailed about Arrow's theorem is already discussed by Professor S.P. Singh. You can refer to that. Okay, but since this is these are the part of the policy decision making, so I am just briefing about all those democratic decision processes. Okay, the third could be, because the first we discussed about aggregate, right? First one we discussed about aggregating preferences. The second one we discussed about Arrow's impossibility theorem, right? And the third one will be discussing about the legislative processes, okay, for policy decision making in a democratic society. Okay, so if you see the world politics and the system, the political system, then we can find two broad systems for policy making or decision making. The first one is parliamentary form of governance or parliamentary system, and the second one is the what is known as the presidential system. Okay, so what is parliamentary system? Ours is a case of parliamentary system, right? UK has the parliamentary system, and where a presidential form of governance or presidential system is practiced, we can take the case of the USA. Okay, so given this example, now we can draw a difference, in fact, by understanding these terms: parliamentary form of governance, parliamentary system, and the presidential system. Okay, so what is this parliamentary system? In parliamentary system, if you refer to our own country, right, we have a PM, right, Prime Minister. So parliamentary system is led by the PM, who is elected by a majority of the member of parliaments, okay, MPs, member of parliaments or MPs. So if a single political party controls a majority of seats in the parliament, what happens? The Prime Minister would be from that particular party, right? So the Prime Minister will be the leader of this party. So that is the parliamentary form of governance, and the decision is taken based on this parliamentary system. Okay, and suppose say the Prime Minister, the PM's party, right, the party in which the PM is also a member, right? So if PM's party loses power in the parliament, then of course he or she, his or her tenure as PM will end, right? So that is what is our parliamentary form of governance for policy decision making. And let's discuss about the second one, that is presidential form of governance for policy decision making, and we are referring to the case of the USA for this presidential form. Okay, so in the presidential form, voters elect the legislature and also the chief executives separately. Okay, and so since voters elect the legislature and the chief executives separately, then the majority party in the legislature may or may not be the same political party that the president belongs to. Okay, so that is the difference between the presidential form of governance, right, and the parliamentary form of governance. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can move to the next one, right, the rent seeking process, in order to understand further about the policy decision making, right, the process of policy decision making. Okay, so what is this rent seeking? Rent seeking is a process, right, by which the political interests use some power of the government. So government has different kinds of power, like regulation and taxation are very much pronounced. Okay, so in rent seeking, right, the rent seeking involves a process, or rent seeking is itself a process by which the political interests use the power of the government, okay, to secure some kind of economic benefits. Okay, and this rent seeking is in fact derived from the concept of economic rent, right? And what is this economic rent, right? So this economic rent is an economic profit, right, that is not bid away by usual competitive forces. We know that the benefits are generally removed or reduced by the competitive process, but for economic rent, right, since it is an economic process, so here the economic profit is not bid away by usual competitive forces. Okay, and the seminal idea on this concept of rent seeking was discussed by George Stigler right? In his article published in 1971, the title of this article was The Theory of Economic Regulation, okay, and he got the Nobel Prize partially for this work, right? That is the theory of economic regulation. And as a part of his doctoral dissertation, he has examined this theory, and he has taken the example of occupational licensure to explain what is this rent seeking process and what is the rent seeking behavior, okay. So let's understand this example that he has taken into account while explaining and writing his doctoral thesis on the theory of economic regulation, right? So what is the example he has taken? I told you that it is the case of occupational licensure, okay. So occupational licensure can protect, in theory, it can protect the public from incompetent specific providers, right? It can also create a kind of barrier, right, to the entry in the licensed professions, okay. So when I mention about occupational licensure, you must be imagining about that for particular occupation like dentist, if the dentist want to practice, right, or a doctor want to practice and wants to open a clinic, then he or she has to apply for a license. Without license he cannot practice, or a psychologist, right? So and certain occupation needs license, otherwise it is not possible to operate his business or her business, okay. And for that, while taking this example, since he tried to explain the theory of economic regulation, okay, so I'm giving you an example that how occupational license can prohibit, right, the entry of newcomers, okay, and how it can benefit the existing farms or existing industries, okay. So for example, that suppose say there is a new city, okay, in a new city, right, only one business is there, one typical business is there, let's say it is a pizza making, okay. So this business is there, okay. So what will happen? So since this is the single supplier or single seller in the entire city, then its profit would be high, right? But since profit is high, the other business houses or other potential entrepreneurs who might have sensed the market and who might have learnt that pizza making becomes a very profitable business in this city, let's open another pizza house in the same city, okay. So what will be happening right now? So as a result, there would be competition, okay. So in order to in order to establish this one, the second business person, the second business house will definitely increase the quality of the pizza or decrease the price, okay, so that it can also get a market share, okay, and it can also get established in this city as a pizza house, okay. So as a result, what would be happening? The profit of this particular, the original pizza provider, supplier will get down, okay. And formally or legally, the first pizza house or original pizza house has no means or no tools to forbid the entry of the second in the market. But however, the government has. And many times the government also issues license, right, for the occupations. As I told you, the license issued to psychologists, to dentists, to doctors and so many other professionals, right. So the government has the right to issue licenses, okay. So that means if the government prevents that in this particular new city only one license would be issued for pizza vending, then of course the first one would be getting, because it has a long years of business, right, long history of business, and the second one will not be, okay. So as a result, what would be happening? The profit of this one would be increasing, since the second one will not be getting will not be allowed to operate, right, in this city, and it will not be able to get the license, okay. So in this context, we can say, or we can find that this is a case of rent seeking. That means, if this particular pizza house, right, since it doesn't have the legal power to forbid, to prohibit the entry of the second, may utilize the power of the government, right, to prohibit its entry. So, as a result, the economic rent of the first one would be increased, and here we are finding a case of rent seeking. Okay, so that means a rent seeking behavior is created here. Okay, and so there are many other means, through many other not very transparent means, through which the first pizza house would be funding to the government in many other cases. Okay, which is the study under the political economy area as well. Okay, so what is the contribution here? The contribution of this theory that we are finding, which was examined by George Stigler, that he proposed a theory in which the political actors use regulation, and here the example of regulation is license, as a tool for advancing their own economic interests. So, here the economic interest of the first pizza owner has increased, right, and that is the reason it is also contributing to the government, okay, in other not very transparent way. And so, this rent seeking behavior occurs when individual or business uses resources, money, time, right, to increase their wealth by manipulating political or economic system. And in this example, the political tools or political powers are manipulated, okay, rather than creating new wealth. So, instead of increasing the quality of pizza, instead of getting some innovation in pizza making, right, right, so that the new buyers would be created. So, rather than doing it, right, here we can find a behavior where economic rent of the pizza house maker has increased, right. And so, this particular behavior, this particular theory was analyzed by economist George Stigler, and he showed that industries use this political lobbying to buy favorable rules which block competitors and raise price. Okay, so many times we are finding this kind of scenarios in our society. Okay, so George Stigler argued that the government regulations in form of licenses, tax, or a new tax, let's suppose say, okay, or tariffs, tax or tariffs, are rarely meant to help the public. Instead, established firms, established business houses, they demand these kind of rules in form of licenses, new licenses, okay, modified licenses, new tax, new tariffs, to keep out the new entrants, new rivals, so that their business would be intact. In fact, their economic rent would be increasing. Okay, so so the contribution of this rent seeking behavior, it proposed a theory in which the political actors use regulation as a tool for increasing their own economic interest. Okay, so since we are discussing how the political processes, or what are the political processes through which the policy making is done, right, or policy making happens. So, this is also a part of this political processes, or policy making processes. Okay, policy, what you can say, how policy is, or a decision is taken into account, policy decision making. Okay, so what is the takeout of these policy decision making theories that we discussed? Okay, and particularly from the last one, that is rent seeking. So, the takeaway from this the discussion or theory of rent seeking is that if the government has the capacity to dispense financial favors in terms of tax or regulatory policy, then the business houses, individuals, or firms will engage in rent seeking behavior in order to get more profits. Okay, but however, as I told you already, this rent seeking behavior is non productive because It is not, in our example of pizza making, it is not increasing the quality, right? Or no additional buyers are created, right, because of the increased quality of pizza, right? Rather, the profit is only getting increased by this particular license systems, okay, limiting the entrance, prohibiting the new entrance, new rivals. So the rent seeking behavior is non-productive use of society's resources because it consumes time, energy, and also the talent without generating any gains in productive way or productive output. Okay, so the next portion of our discussion is the different typology of public policy, and we are taking into account the framework of Theodore Lowi's policy typology. So, today we will be discussing what is his proposition about the policy typologies, what are the importance of these typologies. Then we will be discussing these four different typologies of public policy he proposed: distributive, redistributive, regulatory, and constituent policies. So, let us discuss about this framework of the typology of public policy propounded by Theodore Lowi. So, before understanding his proposition of the typology of public policy, we must understand that who is he and what is his contribution in the public policy. So, as we can see that Theodore Lowi, he was an eminent American political scientist, and he worked a lot in the sphere of public policy, and basically he is very well known for his contribution, for his argument that is policy determines politics. So, what is the meaning of this policy determines politics? That means what kind of policy a government adheres to, what kind of policy and laws and regulation a government enacts. So, that determines the shape of politics. Rather than saying that politics shapes the policy, he proposed a new argument that the policies can determine the politics, and that is the reason he is well accepted in the public policy, and that is the reason we can say that he made a revolution in the public policy itself. And if you see his major contribution, then we can think about the contribution in terms of typology creation. So, this is a fourfold policy typologies consisting of distributive policies, redistributive public policies, regulatory public policies, and the constituent public policies. And initially, he proposed this fourfold type of typology of public policy in his article in 1964, and then there was a refinement in his own framework, and in this refinement in 72 articles he proposed this four system of policy, politics, and choice. And both these references, that is public policy, some case studies from initial proposition to the fourfold system of the public policy, politics, and choices are already given in the reference section. So, if you want, you can also explore this. So, what is the importance of this typology? Because we understand what is public policy, what is the meaning, what is the concept, what are the different concepts like output, outcome, impact. So, all these are very inherent, very important characteristics of public policy that we have understood. But what is the new classification, or what is the purpose of doing further classification in the public policy itself? So, we can say that this fourfold classifications of the government actions that was proposed by Lowi. So, it is based on the likelihood and target of coercion. So, what kind of coercion a particular public policy can have. So, based on this understanding, these fourfold classifications were proposed, and if you see the classification, I think there is an importance, there is a benefit if we do this kind of classifications. So, these classifications can be very helpful in understanding, in distinguishing among the public policies, and also generalizing the public policies as well. So, if we accept, or if we thus utilize this framework of the Lowi's, then we can think that it is a good indicator if we have to differentiate among or between policies, or if you have to generalize the policies as well, then we can take this framework. And this is in something which is in contrast and which is which is also a better framework in comparison to the traditional categorizations of the public policy schemes, like the schemes of the public policies in the conventional area in the old days were classified based on issue area, like whether the policies are under the labor or whether the policies are under the foreign affairs or welfare aspects, or you can think about the public policies in terms of different institutions, that whether the policies are coming under the legislative policies or the departmental policies or judicial policies, and likewise. And moreover also we have already understood the policies that were especially framed after the World War, and some policies were also there in the before the World War. So we are drawing a comparison of policies post World War and the and pre World War as well. So the conventional way of categorization of public policies were based on the issue area, based on the type of institutions and institutional regimes, and also based on the time framework as well. But while we have done this fourfold categorization of public policy, they provide with a very broad notion of the scope, the diversity and the purposes of the public policies as well. So that is the reason we think that there is a benefit of accepting this, the Lowi's framework of public policy, fourfold public policy. So, and moreover, if we do this typology, then it is also helpful in differentiating the policies on the basis of their impact on the society or effects on the society, the kind of relationship they do have with the other institutions, with other factors and variables. So all this can be identified. So that is the reason it is better to have these typologies of public policy for better understanding, for analysis. So understanding this concept of the fourfold policies, right, and why should we go for a typology of public policies? The first one that is proposed by Theodore Lowi is the distributive public policy. So here we need to understand what is this distributive policies and what are the features of it. So while thinking about any policies which have distributive features, so it means the allocation of the resources or allocation of benefits and services would be there. So allocation part is emphasized here. So distributive policies involve the allocation of benefits, allocation of services or allocation of resources, but these allocations will be at no charge. And moreover, many times we are finding that these allocations or benefits which are created or which are provided at no charge to a targeted section of population, maybe a targeted section of individuals, communities or companies or groups. So that depends upon the target of the public policy, what kind of public policy that we are thinking about. So for example, you can think about that subsidizing the e-vehicle users. So it is a targeted benefit for those customers who want to use the e-vehicles, right? So who want to purchase e-vehicles, so they will be getting some subsidies. So this is like this is a distributive policy because it allocates benefits to a targeted section. So that means if a customer is there but he is not willing to purchase the e-vehicles, rather a conventional diesel or petrol run vehicle, then he will not be getting this benefit. We can also take into account some other examples like grants, loans, or even we can think about the information that we receive in terms of weather forecast, that is very essential in Indian context, in the context of the climate change as well. So all these are all these distributive policies involve the allocation of benefits and services, but yes, it is very target oriented. Then you can think about that these distributive policies can serve to enhance the prices sometimes. It can also serve to increase the incomes, right, or it can also serve to reduce the cost or even risk of actions, or it can encourage the research or economic development. It can also promote economic activities. It can also promote recreational opportunities like corridor, tourism purposes. We are doing multiple travel and tour corridors as well. So all these are done under this distributive public policies, and sometimes depending upon the situations, it can serve to increase the prices or increase the income, it can reduce the cost and likewise. So that means depending upon the target, the distributive policies can provide the targeted outcomes. So suppose say that we want to know that how these distributive policies may serve to increase the prices. So for example, so we can think in this way that let us say that the government wants to promote a particular technology, so maybe a green technology in a particular sector. So as a result, the government would be subsidizing it. When the government would be subsidizing it, then of course for let us say consumers, the price for the producers, the cost of production would be low. So as a result, what would be happening, that when the cost of production would be low, then of course there would be a great demand for that particular product. So as a result, what would be happening, because of the dynamic factors in the market, the prices would be increased because there is a great demand, right. So as in this way, we can think that since it is a distributive policy, distributive policies may influence in increasing the prices, or sometimes we can think about how in a particular situation the distributive policies may increase the income as well. And if you see the nature of these policies, that as I told you that depending upon the context, it can target to increase the prices or incomes or even reduce the cost or risk of the actions, and likewise. So these policies especially do not impose any cost to any specific group or sections. Rather, we can think about, of course there is a cost because it would be from the exchequer, from the treasury, from the government's pocket. So it would be a cost to the government, but it would not be imposing such cost, any cost on specific sections of the society. Rather, these costs are paid by the public treasury. So that is the reason these distributive policies appear to create only a win-win situation, that means winner situations, and since there is no specific losers, then we can say that yes, it is a win-win situation, that it can create winners in terms of getting enhanced benefits or enhanced services. So understanding this distributive policy, now we can shift to the regulatory policy. So what is this regulatory policy? From the very name of this concept, we can say that the policies would be framed in such a way that it would be regulating consumers, regulating producers, regulating individuals or some targeted sections. Okay. So this regulatory policies impose, of course, restriction on the behavior of the individuals or groups or the targeted sections, as I told you. And these regulatory policies can, when there would be restriction, then of course it can curtail the freedom or discretion to act right, of those we are targeting to regulate. And here we can find there is a clear difference between the distributive policies and these regulatory policies. What is that? That how this regulatory policy is clearly distinct from the distributive policy, because this increase in case of distributive policy, it increase the freedom or discretion of the persons or the groups, those who are going to be affected. But in case of these regulatory policies, then we are finding that there is a restriction on the behavior of the individuals and groups. Okay. So here in this case, then the distinction is clear, that in case of distributive policy, the policies would increase the freedom, whereas in regulatory policies, the policies are going to curtail down or restrict the freedom. So while thinking about this regulatory policy, we can think about some of the policies which can control or restrict the freedom or discretion of use. For example, pollution control. So now we can think about that if you are riding, right, and you have a vehicle which is old enough, which is not right now permitted. So let's say that it is manufactured in early 2000, then perhaps it is not allowed so far the pollution parameters are concerned. So as a result, what will be happening, that your discretion to use that particular vehicle which is old enough, where the technology is not advanced enough to minimize the pollution, so that is the reason you may not be able to use that particular vehicle on road, right? So that is the example of pollution control, that how pollution control as a policy, it restricts the behavior of the individuals. So you can think about so many other groups as well. You can think about the industries, you can think about farms as well, companies as well. So you can think about multiple cases that how these regulatory policies restrict the behavior of those. And sometimes we can also find out that these regulatory policies can deal with the criminal behavior against property, against persons as well. And that is the reason we have different sections, legal sections to deal with this criminal behavior. As a result, it cuts down that whether a person would be interested to commit a crime, or the law can disincentivize or discourage to not to commit the crime. So that part of criminal behavior is also falling under this regulatory policies. So under this broad regulatory policies, apart from this criminal behavior that I just discussed about, so we can think about the other parts of the regulatory policies. For example, we can think about the social regulatory policies. Okay, so what is the social regulatory policies? The society is creating a particular set of controlling, what you can say, controlling the behavior or promoting some kind of positive behavior through the social setup, through social norms, through social practice. So all these are the example of the social regulatory policies. For example, you can think about affirmative actions taken by a particular community, or we can think about that in order to build students' character. So school prayers are very much encouraged. So there are regulations or actions against pornography as well, against abortions. All these policies can regulate the personal behavior as well. So all these are the examples of your social regulatory policies. And if you see social regulatory policies and competitive regulatory policies, then if you follow this, then we can think about this competitive regulatory policies restrict entry into a particular business, like we have this spectrum distribution, we have this television broadcasting. So everywhere we can find that there is a competition regulatory policies are there, so that there is a restriction into restrictions so for the entry into this type of business are concerned. Sometimes these regulatory policies are in form of monopoly or natural monopoly. Sometimes we can find out that it is because of regulatory regulations only the monopoly or the pseudo monopoly kind of situation is created, but here it is because of regulation itself. So this is called competitive regulatory policies, which restrict entry into a particular business, particular activity, the examples that we have already mentioned. The other subsections of regulatory policies are in form of self-regulatory policies. So we already discussed about the social regulatory policies, criminal regulatory policies, right? Competitive regulatory policies. So this is another type of regulatory policy, that is self-regulatory policies. It is very similar to the competitive regulatory policy, because the self-regulatory policies also involve restricting or controlling some matter or some group. So we can think about that these self-regulatory policies are usually in such a way that they can control the particular segments of the society or particular group, so that it can protect or promote the interests of its members. So the case that you can cite here as self-regulatory policies are the license for the doctors, or we can think about the psychologist, pharmacist, nurses. So for all these we can find that there is a particular body which gives the license so that you can continue your economic activity. And here we can find, if you see this particular policy, then we can find this policy making pattern, right, that for a particular society or for particular occupational group, they act on its own to seek for licensing the legislation from the state legislature. So that is the reason we have this body for psychologists, we have this group for doctors, right, and likewise. So that means they self regulate themselves in a particular area. And the third one would be redistributive policies, because in the first case we have already discussed what is distributive policies and what are the very features and consequences as well, because it only creates winners not losers as such. But yes, in case of redistributive policy it is bit different. What is the difference here? So in case of this redistributive policy, it involved a deliberate effort by the government to shift the allocation of resource or allocation of wealth, income or property, or even allocation of rights among different classes or different groups of the population, such that the allocation would be across the haves, have-nots. Allocation would be through allocation for the proletariat and bourgeois, the allocation for poor and rich, depending upon the nomenclature, that whatever the allocation that we need to do. And here if you see that allocation in terms of wealth, income, property or right across different sections of the society or different what you can say targeted sections. So the objective of these redistributive policies involved that we emphasize, in case of let's say it is the allocation of property or allocation of income, let's say. So then the objective of the redistributive policy is that how we can own the property rather than use the property, right. So what is owning the property? Owning the property means you have the property right on a piece of land, let's say, on your wealth. But it does not merely mean that if someone is having user rights for over a particular property or wealth, then it is not the example of redistributive policy. Okay, so redistributive policies try to create a situation where the property, there would be allocation in terms of property itself, ownership of the property itself, rather than just getting the user right for that particular property. So that is the reason we can say that the target involved in this redistributive policy is not the use of property, but property itself, not equal treatment, but equal possession, not behavior, rather but being. So in this pattern, when we find, then we can find that there is a pattern in redistributive policy. And what is the pattern we are finding? That in this case, be it property, be it the in case of treatment or possession, then we are finding the pattern is the shift in resources from one hand to another, which is the one hand. So maybe the shift of resources from haves, those who are having enough, to those who are not having enough. So however, if you see that this very pattern can be reversed as well, depending upon again the reversal policies as well, that how it can be also transformed from have nots to have. So we have already our history, right, in the colonial period, and we have already experienced that how resources have or had at that point of time shifted from have nots to haves, and that is the reason they grow. There was an wealth accumulation at that particular point of time, only in a few hands. So when I say that in redistributive policies we are finding shifting of resources from one hand, basically from haves to have nots. The example we can think about the farm subsidy, the subsidy that is provided by the government to, let's say, agricultural land holders. Okay, and this redistributive policies are really very difficult to enact because they involve reallocation of money, reallocation of rights and power, and that is the reason in the political system also it needs a greater need of dialogue, discussions and negotiations as well. And the last one, the last part of the typology of public policy propounded by Theodore Lowi is of the constituent policies. What is this constituent policies? These constituent policies are formally and very explicitly concerned with the structure of the government, the establishment of rules, the establishment of some kind of institutional mechanisms, the conduct of the governance or the distribution systems or judiciary systems, how power is distributed, divided between institutions. So, all these are under this constituent policies. And for example, since I told you that constituent policies may be in terms of establishment of the government structure. So, for example, we can think about the formation of Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And earlier, this was a part, the activities related to the what you can say environment or forest or climate change, it was earlier under the ambit of Ministry of Agriculture. So, from Ministry of Agriculture, we have formulated another ministry, that is the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So, this is the case of your constituent policies, because constituent policies are concerned with establishment of the government structure. So, we altogether formed a different structure in order to take care of the activities or policies related to environment, forest and climate change. So, as I told you that I have already given the references about the formulation of this fourfold public policy typologies. So, initially it was propounded by Lowi in this article in 63, and then after he revised and again framed given an integrated framework, that is fourfold systems of the public policies, fourfold typologies of public policy in 72. So, you can refer both of these. So, thank you very much. In the next class, we will be continuing from here only. Thank you.